Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. This is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, Myster E. So, Myster E, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4AS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well. And again, we have another interesting topic today because
hmm
I've been reading a bit of anarchism lately, and I've been going back to the classics, and one of them I've been reading is Michael Bakunin's God and the State.
Mm,
And just with everything that we're kind of going through right now in the world, cost of living crisis, housing crisis, but, recessions all around. Um, I think it's interesting going back to Michael Bakunin and the origins of anarchism
mm,
because his huge thing was political skepticism.
mm,
And what I essentially mean by that is that, one of the foundations of anarchism is the idea of you shouldn't believe in political structures or structures, period, if they're based on authority. So they
mm,
kind of have to have a reason and yeah, they kind of have to have a reason in order to be. And if they aren't like if they don't have a purpose,
mm.
then you shouldn't believe in them or in that structure at all.
Yeah,
And that's pretty much the foundation of God and the State, which will, naturally we'll go into today. But I thought it would be a topic that would be good to discuss today.
yeah. I think that's one of the main tenets of anarchism, um, and shared by, I would say, most anarchist thinkers, is that idea that you're talking about, that if you're going to have some type of formal institution, some level of hierarchy or authority, which is, big no-no for the old anarchists,
Mm,
is that it is only acceptable in the sense that the structure is able to completely justify its existence. And
mm,
if it ever fails to justify its existence or being there, then it needs to be dismantled. And if it's necessary to put it back together again, then you rebuild it from the ashes.
mm,
But like it must justify itself and serve a legitimate purpose. And lots of hierarchical structures, which anarchists will argue, are they've been built up for a reason potentially, but then they fail to serve that purpose moving forward, and they just maintain some type of power relationship and a status
mm.
quo. And anarchists are all about no domination of any person over another, or person or group over another group.
Hmm.
And so any institution fails to be able to continue to fully justify itself moving forward and must be dismantled.
Yes, and that's where we get to the distinction where he's pretty much in the first paragraph. He says like, who is important in society and who is right in society? Is it the materialists or the ideologues, the idealists, as he calls them?
Mm, mm,
And he does this huge thing that it's the socialists, so not the utopian socialists, but the material socialists, which are what he calls the materialists. And then he basically says it is God and the state. So it is the foundation of the church as well as the state that reinforces authority, which is what stems out of idealism. Because it, it's basically those structures are there because they're there to reinforce authority rather than to showcase humanity and liberty, as he likes to say it. And that's the reason why, in like the first half of the book, he really focuses on the Voltaire quote of it's something along the lines of, if God doesn't exist, then we should we should bring him into existence. It's
Mm.
something along those lines. And as
Yep.
you can probably see in that first quote there, therefore, if God existed only in one way, could he serve human liberty by ceasing to exist, a
Mm.
jealous lover of human liberty and deeming it to be absolute condition of all that we admire and respect in humanity. I reverse the phrase of Voltaire and say that if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him.
Mm.
So, because he's basically reversing that Voltaire quote,
Mm.
he's basically saying that um, authority doesn't establish liberty; it just completely abolishes it. And that's why in the middle half of the book, he really focuses on, well, if somebody is an expert, their expertise should be valued. But what he does is that, yeah, but when somebody's an expert, so for example, like a tradesperson compared to a scholar and
Mm.
somebody that performs pedagogy or is a teacher, and what people that have liberty, materialists, should do is that they should trade their expertise with one another, but not to double down with institutions and say, you must follow what I do or it's the highway.
Mm.
And it's a very interesting way of looking about things.
Mm. Yeah, because I think he goes on to, I'm not sure if it's in this work, but in other works, he kind of warns society against technocrats in a way, or some form of the development of, uh, I think it's technocracy.
Yes.
Yeah. And like, a state or some type of society that's built on the authority of individuals who understand certain things better than others, and then therefore they justify their position at the top of the social hierarchy because they are the holders of this information. And I believe he even extends that to, I guess you would say, state collectivists, so people
Mm,
that are happy to have an authoritarian state bring in some type of communist style of living. And he's worried about communists, like, forming some type of a vanguard party and then using their understanding of the revolution and new society and all that sort of stuff to control that society,
mm,
which is kind of, I guess, his warning and a very prescient kind of look at what happens in, I guess you could say, one of the first socialist revolutions being the Russian
mm,
Revolution, where you have like a one-party state and yeah, um, a small and closed collection of people that get to decide what's best for everyone because they've studied the revolution and they know kind of all the tactics and what should be used to try and rule and run that society. But that will always end up, um, I guess, being a perversion of those kind of revolutionary ideals because those people will just take power and it will corrupt them every time, and they'll end up just being as bad as any other type of oppressive hierarchy. So,
yes. Yeah, I'm very glad that you brought up technocracy because yeah, like that's definitely halfway through the book because once he kind of establishes what it's like what liberty for materialists is, which is basically that second quote I've got there. The liberty of man consists solely of this, that he obeys natural laws because he has himself recognized them as such, and not because they have been externally imposed upon him as
mm,
any intrinsic will whatsoever, divine or human collective or individual. So,
mm,
yeah, again, this is when he's starting to get into the idea of a technocracy where he's talking about, well, you could have a science college that establishes themselves because they produce good things about the natural laws, but once you then establish a structure that not is focusing on the liberty of man, his abnormality, and his flaws, and how to improve his flaws or how to improve society around him, but it then switches the gears that it's actually focusing much more on its authority and everything to reinforce its authority,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it is natural to I guess, to use an old phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That
Yeah.
it'll
Yeah.
eventually get into a cycle of moving away from the science and
Yes.
then leading
Yes.
itself to reinforce its power
Yeah.
and to hold on to that power,
Mm.
and then it instead of it being to reinforce man's liberty, it's to reinforce power and authority.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of like I think he touches on this. He might provide examples, but it's like, yes, like you said, like you get an institution together, like a scientific body, and they're there to obviously, collect knowledge and further the understanding in a particular field or something like that. But then because they are kind of an authority on this particular topic, then they end up becoming an institution that rejects, I guess, any thought that is outside of the thoughts and the doctrine of that institution. And so it kind of inhibits the growth and the what's the word? The integrity
Mm,
of that group of people, because instead of trying to find new ideas and expand themselves forever, perpetually, they end up just holding on to, I guess, the the hierarchical form that gives them um, their existence, and so they basically start clamping down and degrading their very reason for being,
mm,
because they're stopping anyone that would challenge kind of their power and their authority by bringing in new ideas or challenging like their ideas and the status quo.
yeah.
And I think this whole conversation then goes back to very much the core of anarchism for most anarchists, but like particularly Bakunin goes into this, like in a majority of his works, they all center on the theme of individual freedom is the central feature of anarchist thought and theory, and the central feature of any anarchist society. It's
Mm,
all about allowing the individual the utmost freedom. And that's why hierarchical institutions, in almost any form, I know that there are exceptions when they can completely justify themselves, but any form of hierarchy is wrong, because as soon as you have one person being an authority on something, then they are able to use that authority to suppress somebody else's freedom. And like
mm,
yeah, individual freedom is for anarchists the beginning of all things. If people are allowed to freely express themselves and exist to the utmost,
mm,
then they are able to exist and contribute to society in the best way possible. And
mm,
so without true freedom, like for the individual
mm,
to be able to do basically whatever they want to a certain extent, as long as they
mm,
don't encroach on somebody else's individual freedoms, that is the only way to create a truly communist society, because everybody is able to then contribute what they can and take what they need, and that all centers on that 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 kind of most fundamental notion of absolute
mm.
individual freedom at all costs. And everything for him centers around this. So,
Yeah, yeah, no, no. You do raise a good point with the individual freedom because, yeah, there are some pages that he uh, goes into like painstaking detail. I think this was again around the part where it was basically the trading of expertise between
mm,
specialists. And
mm,
it was the idea of, well, you do a certain job for another person, and
mm,
because of that kind of equal exchange that you have, so the scholar and the tradesperson, like you do that because in order for a society to work, you're still seeing each other as equals. It's just
Yeah.
you're kind of leaning on each other because you have that speciality. But as soon as you establish that that institution for plumbers or that institution for scholars that tries to carve itself out that sort of authority, as in, you go to this institution for scholars if you want to be a scholar, or you go to this institution to be plumbers, um, that's when things start divulging to authority. Like, I
Mm.
don't think he's necessarily would be against, a plumber taking on a tradie, because that sort of structure makes sense. Because if you have a tradesperson that wants to learn a specific trade, then that sort of, I guess, hierarchy, but I think it's just naturally a person that's learning from another person,
Mm.
then that is justified. But do you need a maybe a national tradie association that stands for every single tradie that's within the country?
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
That's probably when Bakunin would be questioning that sort of thing.
Yeah, and because especially because when institutions turn to that type of style, like the one-stop shop or the only institution that can validate whether somebody could be part of this club or not, that's where the value of having that institution ends right there. Because
Mm,
if you're being exclusive and you're like restricting people's access to it because you're the only authority on this particular topic or this particular trade or profession, then it basically will undermine people's freedom
yes.
ultimately, because then you can start saying, well, this person's not a real scientist because they're not part of our club, so don't listen
Mm,
to what they're saying. And that is a form of power and domination. And again, domination and power relationships are completely no-go zones for anarchists.
mm,
And so there's no real value in having people dominate things. Everything is about stopping any form of domination between a group, again, another group, or a group, or person versus person.
yes.
And I look, I have to agree with that perspective, honestly. Like, it's very important, I think, for a free society to have within it a central tenet like individual freedom,
Mm,
to ensure that, yeah, there are no ways which one person can dominate another. But like, I don't think society, or especially today, or ever, probably in human history since, a very, very long time ago, is ready to have kind of social groups and formations and things like that without having clearly cut institutions and forms of hierarchy. I think people find it kind of absurd to think that you could exist in a completely equal society where people can come and go as they please and, establish
mm,
themselves as individuals and operate completely freely. They find it very hard to comprehend a world like that, and they would
mm.
even say that it's rather idealistic to run a society like that, or any type of, I guess, social gathering where people are all equals all of the time.
I'm kind of glad that you brought up how would Bakunin think of our society today.
Mm.
Because I guess that's kind of the reason why I wanted to bring up God in the State, because I feel like, yes, I agree with you in the sense that people would think that you're mad presenting kind of anarchist ideas in the very hierarchical structure we have in
Yeah,
society today, whether it's uh, the government. The government that we have down to just the ordinary corporations that are within our society. Like,
yeah,
we're kind of reinforced with that kind of hierarchy every single day that's kind of
yeah. It's
forced on
everywhere.
us.
It's everywhere.
But I think there is one part of Bakunin's writings that persists, and I think that a lot of people can kind of get behind, is that, you know, political skepticism within society, is that I think that people do tend to look at structures, and you know, this is definitely the case with politics nowadays. Is that people are constantly looking at things and saying, you know, hey, this person standing in front of me who's a politician, like, are they a good person? Do they actually believe in what they're saying? And um, do are they actually doing things for my best interests? Now,
Mm,
the reason why I bring that up is that I think we are in our current stage, like, questioning the institutions that are surrounding us today.
mm,
And this is where I want to bring in the article from the Australian Institute. So
mm,
this is an article that discusses the profit price spiral that's actually happening here in Australia. So for those of you who don't know, the Reserve Bank of Australia is our central bank, and unlike any other institution, eh, like that's kind of has a relationship to the government, or the central bank actually sits completely independent of it. But this article actually goes into the idea of what I would consider political skepticism. Skepticism. Now, why I bring that up is that the Central Bank of Australia, the RBA, has been constantly talking from, I think it was about 2019 up until September 2022, about, oh, the reason why inflation's happening here in Australia and even across the world is because we're currently in a wage price spiral. And they kept on just hammering this thought home. But the Australian Institute actually did, you know, investigations into the numbers and everything. And what they actually found was it's not a wage price spiral, as in compared to companies making a profit, compared to you know, your ordinary workers having a wage. It wasn't necessarily that it was proportionally in favor of wages and the ordinary people within society, but that it was proportionately in favor of company profits. And basically, that companies were price gouging, but it was the RBAs and the central banks that, you know, would press the that would press um, the well, not inflation button, but like the interest rates, sorry, would
mm,
press the interest rate button to increase the interest rates, where assuming that it was actually people with their ordinary wages that were driving it up, but that actually wasn't the truth at all. So that's the reason why I kind of bring up these two. Well, one's a graph and the other's a table. I'll be able to give these to you so you guys can have a good look at it. But the first one that we have here with Figure 2, it actually shows that at the end of September 2022, that between the periods of December 2019 up until September 2022, corporate profits had increased in Australia 38%.
mm,
And that was in comparison to like labor consumption, um, you know, nominal GDP that was kind of at that stage, and and for example, labor consumption was at 18%. So as you can kind of see, it's like the profits are almost double what the labor consumption was actually happening. And what they actually found was a lot of price gouging was happening within those periods. And this is then reinforced by them going on about, oh, you know, wage price spiral, um, assuming that it's basically the 1970s. But the situation is completely different. So this is where that table 3 comes in. So if you can actually see the graph here, you'll see that in the 1970s to the 1980s, the labor share of GDP, so this is basically the wages, that actually increased, 2.42 percentage points. And when you actually look at that in comparison to the modern day example, so 2019 to 2022, um, it's actually gone completely backwards. Wages have gone backwards. So it's not exactly the same as this rhetoric of, well, actually, it's wages that are causing stagflation and they're just completely out of control. Like the situations are completely different.
Yeah.
And they're completely reversed, where profits in the 1970s to 1980s are were down at that stage, so the 2.58 as the graph is showing, but in comparison to the modern day example, up to 3.38 points.
Mm.
So
Mm.
it's a different scenario, and really it's profit surging, and companies, whether that's your small businesses or it's the big corporate profits, they're the thing they're the thing that's out of control, and it is a profit price spiral rather
Mm.
than a wage price spiral.
Yeah. Yeah,
And yeah.
it's an interesting concept. The whole debate on inflation and all that sort of stuff. And it's interesting that there's some kind of graphs that kind of show that there's no relationship between, I guess, wages or wage growth and inflation, and it's actually the reverse. There is a correlation more between corporate and business profits and inflation, because as from my, I'm not an economist, but from my understanding of how inflation really works, is inflation has everything to do with prices of things.
Mm,
And the people that control prices are the people that set those prices. So if all the businesses choose to put up the prices of the goods and the services that they are providing to society, then inflation goes up. And it's merely a matter of choice and nothing else. So if the businesses out there choose to increase the cost of their products and their services, then so inflation will increase. And that's pretty much the long and the short of it. You can get as technical as you want to, and you can measure this and that and try and find correlations
mm,
between different factors. But at the end of the day, it is a conscious decision by the business community whether or not they put up their prices. And inflation is nothing more or nothing less at the end of the day. And so, like, to kind of guilt trip people and send them off on wild goose chases with different words and phrases and all that type of thing to
mm,
explain some phenomenon which is, you know, kind of pushed out of control by, scary economic rhetoric. It
mm.
really is something quite simple at the end of the day. And like, there is a mechanism to control inflation, and that it is done at the point of where people set prices. So if you want to turn around and blame anyone for inflation, then you should be looking at the business community and asking them what they're doing to control the crazy inflation that's plaguing the entire world today, not just in Australia.
Yeah, and this is a bit of a tangent, and actually, this is a point that Richard Wolff has even made. Is that it's funny that you do mention prices, and putting or at least having prices stay at a certain point can actually influence an inflationary period. A point that Richard Wolff has actually made is uh, when Richard Nixon was in power. So this was a conservative
Mm,
U.S. president. Um, they had an inflationary period in, I think it was the 1960s, and when that inflationary period was happening, what Nixon actually did was he put a price freeze
mm,
on America, and he said, "Hey, you wage earner, you union, you can't advocate for increasing your wages. Hey, you company, you can't put up your prices, and if anyone tries to do anything funny, I'll throw you in jail.
Yeah,
And the funny thing was, is that as soon as that happened
yeah,
and prices equalized, they stayed still for a period, suddenly inflation went down.
yeah, yeah.
And again, this is a bit of a tangent because all of this culminates back to, I kind of feel like what is Michael Bakunin's like big point is that once you do have these big central banks, these big companies that
Mm,
are focusing much on their authority to dictate prices
mm.
or their authority in general to say, no, 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 this is the reality, rather
Yeah,
than actually looking at the data in behind, and it's like, oh no, actually it's profits that are rising, it's not wages.
yeah,
Once you do have people focusing much on their authority rather than them doing the numbers,
mm,
crunching and doing the science, then bad things happen in
yeah.
society.
They lose touch with
And
reality. Yeah.
yes, lose touch with reality, and I think it's a lesson that we can kind of borrow from Bakunin is that maybe every now and again we should have political skepticism of our systems, because if we're not skeptical, we get stuff that is showing in these graphs and tables.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what we touched on earlier, but it's a very important point that anarchists make is again that any type of institutional or hierarchical form, it has not only, I guess, the need to justify itself in order to exist, but it also has responsibility as well. And its responsibility is to serve the community, serve society, and complete its function. And then once it ceases to serve people and add benefit or improve the current situation, then like there is just no need for it anymore. And it actually works in the opposite. It actually works to degrade society and
Mm,
destroy improvements and things like that. It needs to be gotten rid of.
mm,
There's just no other way around it. And I have to agree with this way and this logic. And this is like I guess an important kind of um, tenant in a democratic society as well. Like
mm,
uh, democracies are supposed to work in a way that like people elect certain representatives to make sure that this stuff happens for them, or that have some type of oversight on institutions and make sure they don't spiral out of control and cease to be able to justify themselves. But like, unfortunately, the political game these days and why there is a need for political skepticism is because while democracy is important in regulating institutions like corporations and like technocratic institutions like your central banks and stuff
mm,
like that, it may be the it's probably the case that our current modes of democracy and regulation don't always meet the challenge. And they fail to
mm,
keep these institutions in check, and they fail to regulate them properly. But like in a society, I guess without that kind of democratic oversight, where people get angry and they voice their opinions with a vote and trying to get somebody in that will serve a purpose and help regulate these people that are going out of control, you never have that opportunity in a non-democratic society, one that is ruled by some type of authoritarian regime or a fascist kind of take on things. So, like, if democracy works well and it's able to put together kind of yeah elected representatives that have the ability to help regulate certain institutions, then they should be able to work in a way that fully justifies their existence.
mm,
But I think there is a bit of a disconnect with liberal democracy and fully being able to hold institutions and hierarchies account for what it is they do. And that's another big talking point for anarchists. And I think Bakunin talks about this a lot, which is the idea that the current liberal democratic way of doing things, where you have elected representatives that serve a term, is a cause for a lot of political skepticism,
Mm.
because not only do they kind of serve a term, and they are able to kind of do whatever they want within that term, and maybe they'll just get in for the period, and maybe they have ulterior motives and they just get in there and do whatever's in their own best interests, which is very, very damaging, and they can't be recalled.
Mm.
Um, so there's a skepticism in that sense that once they're elected, they've got the free rein to do whatever they want. But he also speaks a lot about how politicians today come from are part of a privileged class of people. So they're
Mm.
given power and authority for a certain period of time without recall. And then that gives them an air of privilege
Mm.
and raises them above the average person in society. Most politicians, and I think this is true, he would argue that are already from the privileged class of society. They're probably already from the economic elites out there, or hereditary elites, people that come from a higher or a higher status in society. And so he sees politics in liberal democracies as a very privileged institution. And
Mm.
so people's natural skepticism of politicians is always justified because they come from a section of society that kind of sits above everyone else anyway. And so that's why him and many anarchists, or if not all of them,
Mm.
are big fans of the old delegate system, which we've talked about a lot for
Yep.
AS, and they don't believe in representative democracy because,
Mm.
like I said before, you get elected for a term and you serve your term, unless you do something crazy and illegal and you get
Yeah.
impeached, or fired. Um, in a delegate system, you're elected to kind of represent the interests of your constituents, but at any time, if you fall off the wagon or you stop representing
Mm.
their interests, they will call you back and they'll pick someone
Mm.
else who can do the job better than you can. And that is, I think, emblematic of the whole anarchist principle right there, is that, like, hey, fine, if you have to give somebody authority to speak on your behalf or do something in your interests, and they fail to justify themselves, they are instantly replaceable, and that power and that privilege can be given to someone who will do the job properly.
Mm. Well, look, you've touched on one of my two favorite subjects, delegates, and would have been nice if you threw in cooperatives in there, but I'll take delegates. I'll
Yeah,
take
yeah.
delegates.
I'm saving
Uh,
that for later.
but like, yeah, like really just going beyond that, I think you would start to have to talk about, like, I guess with hierarchy within society, you'd have to start talking about, the capital order and basically austerity and like how things were kind of established now to why you know central banks are functioning the way they are and the reason why they kind of have that authority. But I think that's a conversation for another day. So with
Mm,
your talk of delegates, I think that's probably a good point to kind of end the conversation on. And of
mm.
course, always the last thing to close out, what's that synthwave art? And this week, the synthwave art was Michael Bakunin analyzing God and the State, and it gave us that. And then
Yeah, it's like
reimagined
retro
it.
Bakunin. Yeah,
Yeah, it reimagined Bakunin as a retro graphics designer,
yeah, yeah.
um,
Interesting.
with an Apple computer.
Mm, yeah,
So
I love
yeah,
it.
take of that what you will.
Yeah.
I'll make sure to give this to you, Myster E, to put up
Mm.
on the podcast. But yeah, I thought that was. I think that's one of the best ones yet.
Yeah, that's great. And it's like I love the level of detail that's in Bakunin as well. Yeah.
Okay. And with that, everyone, keep thinking and keep learning. And to see us out, I'll hand it over to you, Mr. E.
Thank you very much, 4AS, and to all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.